So, bleak news for the Ukrainians from Avdiivka. By the way, earlier today, more reports of heavy fighting from the south, the Russians now advancing further out of the industrial zone that they captured a few days ago, pushing deeper into the area of the Avdiivka perimeter, heavy bombing and shelling by the Russian military. And it seems that the weather has turned cold. There's now quite a lot of snow, which must make the conditions of the soldiers defending Avdiivka harder still. And lastly, lots of bleak news for the Ukrainians from the Krinky area. From Krinky, this little village on the banks, the east bank of the Dnieper River, village where the Ukrainian Marines some months ago established their so-called bridgehead, a bridgehead which has turned out to be a trap. Russians have been relentlessly bombing this particular bridgehead. There's reports that the Russians can now launch, I believe, 2 precision-guided bombs per aircraft, where before they could only launch 1. So more bombs are falling on the bridgehead than ever before. Apparently, before long, it'll be 4 bombs, whereas instead of 2, clearly Russian technologies, military technologies, are developing all the time. But anyway, very, very heavy bombing of the Ukrainian bridgehead in Krinky. Riba, by the way, who has been taking a consistently pessimistic view of the fighting in Krinky from a Russian perspective, he's expressed many times bafflement as to why the Russians have allowed this bridgehead to survive, and has been very critical of the decisions of the Russian military leadership in connection with this bridgehead in Krinky. Anyway, Ariba, in his latest report, says that the bombing and shelling of Krinky has reduced the number of Ukrainian troops within this bridgehead from roughly 500 to between 150 to 200. That would be an astonishing level of loss. I can't, of course, say whether or not it is correct, but anyway, that is what Rybar says. And the Russian Ministry of Defense is claiming that dozens more boats trying to move across the Dnieper towards Krinky, Ukrainian boats, sending in supplies, evacuating people from Krinky, rotating Ukrainian Marines to Krinky and from Krinky, that more of these boats have been sunk by the Russians. I even read one report that said that the Russians, apparently over a 24-hour period, had sunk 19 of these boats, which would be astonishing if it were true. But again, I'm not absolutely sure that I have read that report correctly. But anyway, very bad news for the Ukrainians in Krinky. And to repeat a point made many times, point also made by Brian Beletic at the New Atlas, point made by others, Scott Ritter, for example, and also made by us on the Duran by my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou on his own channel. The forces that the Russians are using in Ukraine at the moment are only a fraction of the total forces that the Russians are gathering in and around Ukraine. Ukraine is currently losing against what is increasingly a ever smaller fraction of the Russian military, as the Russian military steadily increases in size. When and if the Russians decide to commit more of their forces, then this gradual slow motion collapse, which we're seeing on the Ukrainian battle lines, will accelerate markedly, or so logically it seems to me. Now, I suspect the Ukrainians understand that. I suspect that Western governments are starting to understand that. And, well, that, of course, is driving many of their decisions. I am confident that it is the single most important factor that is determining the votes that we are seeing in Congress, for example, and it's also the reason why publications like The Spectator are now publishing, I have to say, overly optimistic articles about the need for talks between Russia and Ukraine. And coming back to that topic, articles about talks between Russia and Ukraine. You actually spend your time reading that article by Owen Matthews in The Spectator, which, by the way, I think you can probably find more useful things to do in terms of the article itself. But anyway, if you were to read that article in The Spectator, it is a classic example of the fallacious approach discussed many months ago by Eve Smith in that brilliant piece she wrote in Naked Capitalism. Because, as Eve Smith said, the problem with the West is that they spend an inordinate amount of time discussing and negotiating with each other about what they should do, and they don't think at all about what the Russians think and might choose to do. And Owen Matthews seems to take it for granted that if the Ukrainians simply came along and offered to negotiate with the Russians and agree to some kind of a freeze of the conflict, the Russians would agree. And as far as I can tell, all the discussions, all the debates that are taking place in the West are still about that, about converting the supposed stalemate into a freeze. Anyway, Western governments, Western commentators, perhaps the Ukrainians also, all talking about this, about broaching to the Russians ideas for a freeze, and ignoring the fact that the Russians have already made it clear that they are not interested in that idea. And why would they be? Why would they agree to negotiate for a freeze when their forces are advancing on the battlefronts and when they are carrying out successfully this grinding attrition on Ukraine? Why would they negotiate just for a freeze when they are in an increasingly strong position to achieve their greater political objectives? Now, I suspect that to the extent that there's any understanding of this fact, you won't find it in Washington or London or Berlin or Brussels or even Paris. You're more likely to find it actually among some people in Kiev. The Ukrainians know perfectly well, or at least some Ukrainians know perfectly well, that if they were to open negotiations with the Russians would not be talking about a freeze. They would be talking about other things that go far beyond a freeze, things like not only neutral status for Ukraine, but ultimately a settlement of the whole conflict in Ukraine, which ultimately brings the whole of Ukraine, save for its western fringe, Galicia and Lviv, all of the rest of it, back into the Ruski Mir, either in the form of an independent state, but one very closely attached and allied to Russia, or perhaps in an even more truncated form than that. And I suspect that one of the reasons why the Ukrainians now are so unwilling to engage the Russians in negotiations is because they understand this. Having said that, the Ukrainians also know that the war is heading towards defeat, that they are unable to fight the Russians and to win against them, that their forces are being ground down. And of course, they're aware of what's going on in the United States. They've seen what happened in Congress. They've seen that funding is likely to end for Ukraine, is likely to end very soon. They know that the Europeans are not in a position to replace or substitute for the United States. And though they remain probably unable to negotiate with the Russians, they need, it seems to me, increasingly, to explain, to provide some kind of explanation to themselves and to their people for their eventual defeat. And the narrative that is now being constructed in Ukraine is that they were betrayed by the West, that the West did not give them all the weapons and equipment and support that they needed. And it is now clear that various Ukrainian officials are working increasingly towards that end, towards constructing, if you like, that betrayal narrative. Ukraine betrayed by the West, that the West didn't supply Ukraine with all that it needed in order to win the war. And of course, we've seen how Zelensky has been doing this. He asked last year for 350 tanks, 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicles, 500 howitzers. He thought that was more than the West would provide. He was already talking, when he made that request, about a possible Mannerheim moment, a moment when he would tell the Ukrainians that there was nothing more that could be done. The country had no option other than to lay down its arms because the Russians were so much stronger. But what instead happened, instead of positioning himself where he could carry out a Mannerheim type moment, he found that, to his horror and astonishment, that the Americans and the Western powers gave him the 350 tanks, 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicles, and 500 howitzers that he was asking for. And then, well aware of that, he's now been increasing his demands. A few weeks ago, he gave his interview to The Economist. He said that Ukraine, in order to win, needed new technologies, robots, and all kinds of new equipment, technologies and machines, some of which either don't exist or which barely exist in presumably unlimited numbers in order to win against the Russians. A request which he must have known was ridiculous. Then he met with General Lloyd Austin in Kiev, as I've discussed in a recent program. He demanded there 17 million shells, more than, as Lloyd Austin told him, more than exist in the entire world. He demanded $400 billion of aid. And yesterday, there were apparently confirmed reports that in discussions between the Americans and the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians came up with another incredible, bizarrely far-fetched package. They not only want F-16s now and ATACMS missiles and many more of them, they also want C-17 Globemaster transport aircraft, unclear what they would be for, what they would do. They want C-130 Hercules aircraft, again, not clear what these would do. They want F-18 Hornet fighters to supplement the F-16s. No explanation of how Ukrainian pilots are supposed to be trained to operate these aircraft. They want everything. They want things in huge and unrestrained and unlimited quantities. And again, all of this happening at a time when Congress, the Senate, is voting against further supplies for Ukraine. And I have to say once more, it looks to me as the Ukrainians making demands, increasingly wild and fantastic demands, knowing that the Americans won't be able to fulfill them. Not in any expectation of getting even a fraction of these weapons. They must know that making demands on this scale, given the current mood in Washington, makes it more likely that they will get less rather than more. Anyway, they're making demands on this scale because they too can see the writing on the wall and they want to establish their alibi for their own defeat, the betrayal narrative that I was talking about. Anyway, all very bizarre and very strange, but it's the facts on the ground, the continued Russian advances, the inexorable build-up that is now taking place in Russia, that is effectively determining the outcome now. Negotiations to bring this conflict to an end were possible. Last year, they came within a millimetre of success in Istanbul in March of last year. They could have been successfully revived in the autumn of last year, or perhaps the winter. It seems to me that they are too late now, and the outcome will be decided, or so it seems to me, by the Russian army. We are, as I said, entering the end game. The vote in the Senate all but confirms it. The news from the battlefronts reinforces it. And the fact that we are entering the end game in Ukraine is highlighted by certain events on the diplomatic front. Now, Vladimir Putin has just been visiting the Arabian Peninsula, and the pictures, the film that has come out of his visits to the United Arab Emirates and to Saudi Arabia are astonishing. The show the Emiratis put on to receive him is, and I hope I'm not going to offend anybody if I say this, it was straight out of a Cecil B. DeMille epic. You had his motorcade trundling along this enormous, magnificent, empty highway. There were ceremonial troops on each side, some on horseback, some on camelback. There was troops lined up as his motorcade passed by. There was bands. There was, I think, a 21-gun salute. He was being received as a conquering emperor. And apparently he had incredibly constructive and positive discussions with the Emiratis. And then he went on from Abu Dhabi, he went to Riyadh. His jet, once again, escorted with Emirati and Saudi permission by his squadron of Sukhoi 35 fighter jets. Again, for anyone who doubts that this was a very real security precaution in case of any attempt by US Air Force units, or either from the Eisenhower or from US bases in Qatar to intercept his flight, I would just point out that those Sukhoi 35s were fully equipped and fully armed. They were brandishing air-to-air missiles. They were clearly there, ready to engage in a dogfight, in a combat with any American jets that might conceivably